So next up, we're going to talk about nutrition and when and why you would possibly use performance enhancing drugs. As we established previously, I don't. Connor has done a little bit, a small amount. And I think one of the main things, as we mentioned, that we want to, I guess, talk about broadly, but also we want to go more in depth with, is that before you really even should be considering this sort of thing, you want to kind of make sure that you're already doing the basics. Probably something a lot of people lack, and something that people may not be aware. Me and Connor started working together. I started working with Connor. I reached out to Connor to, I guess, use him as almost like a consult to as a coach myself. I always want to be learning more, and as Connor spoke about before, you can never know it all. You're always going to not know things.
Yeah.
And so, even though you're using performance enhancing drugs and I'm not, we still know that for the most part, nutrition for, you could say 95% is still the same basis, right? There's certain things to take into account, like supplementation and maybe overall metabolic changes. But other than those things, you need to eat well, I need to eat well for us to both get results.
Yeah, 100%.
So I think that's one of the things that we kind of want to, at least, like we said, go over, and then we're definitely going to delve into the more specific stuff as we go on. But before we talk about when you would use performance enhancing drugs, nutrition, as we mentioned before, is something that can be a little bit muddled up in the industry, I guess, and the way people talk about it, and people maybe either oversimplify things or overcomplicate things. People don't seem to be able to find a middle ground. I want to use what you mentioned before as an example, because one of the things that you talked about was meal timing, and the fact that people, I mean, you could say there's an argument for both. Some people may overcomplicate it, but I think we've seen a lot of people more so oversimplify it. I used to do a fair bit of fasting myself, and I think maybe for the certain people, there's a place for that. But meal timing is something that I think a lot of people get wrong, and I'm noticing a lot with my clients now. What are your thought processes behind performance in general, and how it's impacted by meal timing? How important would you say that it is?
Look, it is, at the end of the day, nutrition always is going to come down to a hierarchy of principles. So, calories, total calories is going to be your most important things in terms of body composition, recovery, general well-being, and then makeup of those calories being macronutrients would be the second most important thing. And then you'd say maybe micronutrients, hydration, below that, and the list would go on. Meal timing is not going to be the most important thing in a nutritional program as to whether you get results or you do not. But I do definitely think there is an impact, a difference in results between eating, say, 2 meals a day and 5 or 6 meals a day. Again, like, for example, as you mentioned, fasting before, if fasting is what allows you to stay under your caloric goal for the day, then I think that is a more beneficial tool than you splitting up your food into 5 meals and going over your food every single day. So, there is some nuance with stuff like that. And again, that goes back to the hierarchy of principles. Calories is more important. So if eating 2 meals a day gets you to your calorie goal, then stick with that. It's a good tool for you. Maybe later down the track, once you've learned some better habits and whatnot, you may be able to start reintroducing a third and a fourth or a fifth meal, or maybe as calorie requirements go up, you might introduce more meals. But back to the original question about meal timing, as someone that needs to perform in the gym, you can't expect to perform if you're underfed, if you don't have nutrients in your blood to be readily used, glucose stored in predominantly in your muscles and your liver to be used during training. The majority of the training we do is going to be ATP and glycogen-based energy systems. There'll be some fat used during training, say some of like your low intensity cardio, and at rest between sets and whatnot. But the majority of our training is going to be fueled by carbohydrates and ATP, and you need to get your carbohydrates in through the diet or your glucose or substrates that your body is able to create and turn into glucose. Obviously, carbohydrates is going to be the easiest path to glucose. So making sure you've got a steady stream of glucose and glycogen in your body around training is going to be very important for performance. And then replenishing all of that post-training is also going to be very important for performance. Um, you know, especially in our sports, we typically are going to see probably more so on the enhanced side than the natural side, but still definitely the natural side. As body weights start to push up, caloric requirement is also going to start to push up. And, for your digestive system, if you're going to be consuming 5,000 or 6,000 calories a day like I need to, you're not going to do that for very long on 2 meals a day. You're going to have terrible digestion. You're probably not going to be able to clear the food very well. You're probably going to end up getting backed up, constipated. And that is not going to help with your performance goals whatsoever. So part of that is going to come down to maintaining digestion. And typically you're going to have a much easier time digesting, say 5 or 6 smaller, 800-900 calorie portions, whatever, to get to that caloric goal as opposed to 2, maybe 3 large boluses. Now again, we have studies recently that have just come out, or I don't think it was a study. I think it was actually a meta-analysis. Do you remember the protein maximum? That was a meta-analysis, wasn't it?
Yeah, from what I remember, yeah.
Yeah. So we've had these meta-analyses of studies come out recently showing that there is, no upper limit to protein post-resistance training. So, you definitely can still get benefit out of consuming these large protein boluses in smaller meals, but is that going to be sustainable over a long period of time if you're consuming a large period of food? Not likely. And as we'll probably touch back on many times in this podcast, how you get good at this, really anything, but especially in bodybuilding, powerlifting, the way you get good at things is being able to do them for a long period of time, day in, day out, consistently for decades.
I think a lot of the stuff, as you mentioned as well, like I wanted to touch on what you mentioned about carbohydrates and using them as a fuel source, because this ties in with the meal timing, right? A lot of the meal timing side of things comes down to eating the right thing before you train and possibly after you train.
Yeah.
And
Pre-workout nutrition is 100% the most important part of meal timing.
Yeah.
So pre, intra, post. If you were to put meal timing in its own little hierarchy, your nutrition around training is the most important nutrition window for the day, in my opinion, 100%.
Yeah, I agree. And I think that, as you mentioned, that you can there's periods of time where you can be burning fat when you're at the gym, but there's certain times, as we mentioned before, when it comes to, it's never about speaking in absolutes, but there's certain things throughout what you are doing where, although they aren't irrelevant, some things can be so close to it that they're not worth considering as a variable, because they overall don't contribute a lot to the actual overall conversation that you're having, right? So something like that is less important because the overall conversation is, how am I feeling fueled? I shouldn't really be worrying about how much fat I'm burning in my workout, which is what some people are concerned of. And it's like that's not what's going to give you that energy. I know I trained yesterday and tagged you in it, as we do when we work with people. And I had, at the moment, everyone's different, but I have and this may not be up your alley. I go through different stages for sure where I have to avoid certain things before I train. And I think for the most part, a lot of people are similar, but you eat anything that's going to cause a lot of digestion, probably not going to have the greatest time when you train.
Yeah, for sure.
So at the moment, I'm going like a LCM, and I put like honey on the LCM, and then I grab a couple of those like corn thins. I want to point out that I am dieting, so I have to be somewhat sparingly with this as well. But the macros work out like it's literally like 2 fat, 2 protein, 50 or 60 carb. And for me, it's really like it's not a lot of calories, so I'm not wasting a lot of food, or not wasting food, but once again, I don't need a lot of food before I'm training, right? I need something that's actually going to be energy. Me having 50 grams of protein before I train doesn't make a lot of sense if if I'm trying to be sparing with calories in that specific situation, because that's not really going to carry over to energy. I'm not saying there's not a time and place for protein before training, but in that situation, that's really light and gives me what I need to train.
Yeah. Yeah, so look, where I would weigh in on that is I am still would push for protein consumption pre-workout so that there is still a steady flow of amino acids available for uptake whilst training. But again, like coming back to like the hierarchy of principles and stuff, if you can't train properly because you can't digest your pre-workout meal, then eat what's going to allow you to train properly. If consuming protein immediately before the gym or, an hour and a half before the gym doesn't sit well with you and you end up, feeling like you're going to throw up and then not able to push as hard as you should be in the gym, then that's going to have more of a negative impact than not consuming that protein pre-workout.
I would also bring up that, of course, now we're doing a vocal thing. I now have like something happening to my throat and I'm coughing 1,000 times. Connor's sweating.
You're just sweating profusely.
We're
It's warm. We're in a warehouse with no air conditioning.
Yes, it is. It is.
Unlike the muscle pit, which does have air conditioning, people just don't know about it.
We said this was going to be a very serious segment, and it's. I knew we wouldn't be able to do it. So one of the things I would also bring up is there's context to everything that you're doing, right? Before I'd trained, I had eaten a fairly high protein breakfast, and then it was probably an hour and a half to 2 hours where I had those carbs, and then I trained maybe for an hour just over, and then I went home and had more protein. So there's context to everything as well. So Connor, in what Connor's saying, absolutely. Like, let's say you haven't eaten anything for 2 hours, then you have a bunch of carbs, then you are one of these people that stands around in gold for 2.5 hours training. These people typically will then, after they train, go, oh, okay, well, now I'm going to get Zambreros because I'm hungry as fuck.
Yeah.
And they get a bunch of, shit, dense food that's not really filled with, it's not high protein. I know that people in America like to talk about Chipotle a lot, but Zambreros is definitely not high protein.
Yeah.
And ultimately you're going to feel good after you eat it because there's going to be a lot of carbohydrates and salt in it. But overall, as Connor mentioned, you look at how your day's structured and you've had a day where you've had a breakfast that may or may not have had enough protein in it, an extremely large window of not eating, which you've decided to structure around your training, which is, as we've mentioned, the most important time, and you've decided to not eat before it and not eat afterwards. And then when you have eaten afterwards, you've eaten shit. You can see why, once again, if you make little changes, if there's maybe an hour difference or a half an hour difference, that's when we're seeing less of an issue. But we can see why people fall into what we're talking about very quickly, where a very small variable becomes a big one. Meal timing may not be that big of a problem, but it's not hard for you to make it one. If you all of a sudden get a little bit busy and then I'm just going to go to Officeworks on the way home, and then you're in there for 45 minutes and then someone calls you and then you're on the phone for half an hour. These sound like really elementary, like kind of trivial little things that we're pointing out. But all of a sudden there's another hour and a half on top of the hour and a half you've already just done where you haven't eaten and you aren't keeping your body full of the nutrients it needs.
I again, I'm going to harp on it again, but like the hierarchy of principles, if something like what Jacob just mentioned happens and you get interrupted and you fall 2 hours off your meal timing schedule, that doesn't mean you fall off for the day. At the end of the day, the majority of your results are going to come from the total day's intake. So you just make up for it later down the track, but it doesn't still mean that you shouldn't still aim to try and have some kind of structure and regularity about your meals. Especially as you progress, you start getting, 100 plus kilos and your food intake gets high. Like if I have a situation like what you just mentioned, where maybe I get an hour and a half behind on my food, where I'm at nearly 6,000 calories a day, that can make it very hard for me to get my day's intake in. So context there is also key. If you're on a 2,000 calorie diet, probably don't need to be worrying about splitting it up into 6 different meals because I don't know about you, but 2,000 divided by 6 was like 320 calories, something like that.
Yeah, I mean,
That's not filling me up. I would much prefer have 3 big meals or 3 relatively big meals, and I know that's going to have a much better outcome for me to stay on my plan, than trying to have these 6 nothing meals that I'm never satisfied
yeah.
throughout the day.
Once again, I think like that's why. I mean, at the moment, and we'll discuss this afterwards, but I've kind of gone a little bit lower on my calories for various reasons, right? Appetite issues at certain points and things like that. But say I'm on around 2,600 at the moment, which is what I'm doing. I'm also doing no cardio and the bare minimum amount of steps I need to do. And I only train 4 days a week and I'm very strictly only training for about an hour. So when you put those into perspective, I don't have a massively active job either. So I know everyone wants to brag about how they're on 4,000 calories a day, but maybe if you're 15 and you're eating all your mum's homemade cooking, you're not really totally aware of how much you fluctuate throughout the day. But being on actual 4,000 calories a day or 5,000 calories in a day, Connor's someone who does it regularly. I have done it for a very consistently long amount of time, a long period of time, and my activity output was huge. And I weighed 105, 110 kilos, so it's not something that you see a lot of influencers try to brag about this shit. But for a lot of in a lot of cases, some of them are either lying, and that happens a lot, or they have a shitload of muscle on them because they're on a
They're on a
fuck ton of
shitload
gear.
of drugs.
They're on a fuck ton of gear. That was the
Yeah,
other thing I was going to say. So,
yeah,
but we,
and like 100%, especially with the pressure to look a certain way in the more physique side of the industry, like fat burners, thyroid hormone, all that type of stuff. Well, I can guarantee it is heavily used amongst a lot of the people that you look up for their body image.
oh
They're
yeah,
taking stuff to allow them to be able to eat more because realistically, like being 8% or under body fat year round is like, I'm not saying it's impossible, but the mental restraint that is required for that and the impact on training performance that it's going to have on, like, there's going to be a few genetic people that can run that lean and be fine. But like for 99% of the population, like the impact on training performance, the impact on day-to-day mood, libido, everything else that's going to come from that uh, extended periods of restricted caloric intake is just it's not realistically sustainable for like probably 1 in a million people can realistically do that.
hmm,
Everyone else does not have the genetics to do that without the addition of drugs.
exactly. Yeah. So overall, like we said, we kind of stuck with meal timing for that one. But we're gonna delve more into nutrition as a whole, but definitely the specific sides of things as well. And we'll move into hydration in the next segment. So that's going to be the end of segment 2.